Welcome to sunny Copenhagen and welcome to the University of Copenhagen. As Governor Signe Krogstrup put it yesterday, I think you've all come to Copenhagen at the best time of the year. You probably found out yesterday that days are long, so you really get a lot for your money's worth by coming now in June. My name is Søren Hove Ravn. I'm one of the local organizers here at the University of Copenhagen, along with my colleague Jeppe Drudel, who's right up there. But of course we couldn't do this on our own, so let me take this opportunity to thank everyone who's contributed to the conference, in particular our local admin staff, some of which I'm sure you've met outside, or the student helpers in red t-shirts that are doing an incredible job. I also want to thank our co-organizers at Danmarks Nationalbank, the Central Bank of Denmark. I can't find Alexander right now, but I'm sure he's here somewhere. It's a pleasure to organize, he's right there. It's a pleasure to organize this with our friends at the Central Bank. And in fact, it's nothing new for us to have close collaborations with the central bank. So in Copenhagen, we have our own macro network. We call it the MPC, and this occasion is not short for Marginal Propensity to Consume, nor for Monetary Policy Committee, but for Macro People of Copenhagen. And it consists of us here at the University of Copenhagen, our colleagues at Copenhagen Business School, and our research colleagues at the central bank. We have internal and external seminars every once in a while. We attend each other's seminars. We have, some of us have visiting positions or guest offices in each other's buildings. And this is really a great way to do what I think this network is really about, the combination of research and policy relevance or policy work more generally. So I know that many of you have similar types of networks at your home institutions. And for those of you who don't, I can only encourage you to try and build what you can think of as mini CEBRAs that might make research and policy collaborate more closely, not just in the annual conferences, but also in daily life. And otherwise, it's a great pleasure now to hand over to Amy for this exciting panel debate that we'll do. So once again, welcome, and Amy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel on revisiting trade policy, tariffs, protectionism, and global integration. My name is Amy Zhuang, and I'm from the Danmarks Nationalbank, the central bank. Over the past few years, trade policy has moved back to the center of the macroeconomic debate. Tariffs, industrial policy, and geopolitical considerations are really shaping global trade patterns. And we have seen that very clearly last year. And this raises a number of questions for economists and for central banks. Are we witnessing a structural shift away from global integration? How do tariffs affect inflation, exchange rates, and global imbalances? And to what extent do financial linkages change the traditional view of trade policy? Those are not just only academic questions, but are highly relevant for central banks, for particularly how we think about inflation dynamics, about external shocks, and policy trade-offs. So today we have an excellent panel bringing together complementary perspectives from macroeconomic theory to monetary policy, and with experiences from small open economies. So we originally planned 3 speakers, but unfortunately, Tommaso Monacelli is unable to join us today. We have 90 minutes together. The format will be that each speaker will give a short presentation, after which we will open for discussion and take questions from the audience. So let me now introduce our first speaker, Dmitry Mukhin, from the London School of Economics. His research focuses on international macroeconomics, particularly trade, capital flows, and global imbalances. Today, he will present his recent work on optimal macro tariffs, focusing on how trade imbalances and external financial positions shape tariff designs. Dmitry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. And so we originally planned that I would focus on the long-run implications of imbalances and tariffs, and Tommaso would talk more about short-run implications, kind of direct implications for the monetary policy. So I will still focus on the long-run thing, but I'm more than happy to discuss also short-run implications during Q&A session. Okay, but for now, let me just focus on this topic, and I guess motivation is pretty obvious, right? So in 2025, we saw a record rise in US tariffs, right? So they reached the highest level since the end of the Second World War. And even though the Trump administration has given many reasons why they think this is a good policy, it helps with fiscal situation, it brings back jobs, etc. In the end, once they chose the numbers, right, when they decided what tariffs to impose on different countries, the main input was the bilateral imbalance, right? So it seems like the main reason Trump wants these tariffs is because he's very much concerned with global imbalances. And so here's just a picture which kind of shows that, well, there is this thing in the data, right? So starting from 1980s, every single year, US has been running a current account deficit or a trade deficit, right? So in other words, every single year, US has been borrowing on top what it already borrowed before, right? And it really doesn't look like, our standard intertemporal models where, in bad times maybe you borrow, in good times you repay back, save, and so you kind of, in that case, we would just expect this trade balance and current account to change the sign quite frequently. Instead, we see that on average, right, it is negative and quite substantial. And so that raises three important policy questions, right? The first one is kind of a positive question. So is it true that policymakers can use tariffs to fight these imbalances, right? Is there any way to eliminate this trade deficit, or maybe for other countries, trade surplus, using trade instrument? And it's not obvious, because usually we think that this current account, for example, it's an intertemporal thing. It's not a static thing, while tariffs, it sounds more like a static instrument. Then the second question is normative. So even if you can do that, do you really want to do that, right? Is it, or kind of more generally, is it true that countries which have larger trade deficit, it is also optimal for them to choose higher tariffs? And then finally, the third question coming back to the origins of the trade imbalances, right? Many people, there's a large literature which argues that this is all due to exorbitant privilege, right? The fact that US assets are in high demand, so US can kind of gets extra income in financial markets, which allows the country to sustain this trade deficit. And so the question is, what are the implications of tariffs for this long-run US exorbitant privilege? Okay, so let me kind of go through this, and I will give you some arguments. Some of them are valid, some of them are wrong, right? But I think it's kind of it helps to understand which ones make sense and which ones not. So let me start with the very general accounting identity, right? You take country's budget constraint, you integrate it across periods, and then you get intertemporal budget constraints. So this is what you get, right? So the first term here is just the long trade balance, or you can call it intertemporal trade balance, right? It is discounted sum of all trade balances across periods for the country. And so, in case of the US, this is a negative number, right? So how can you have a kind of permanent negative trade balance? Well, you need somehow to finance this. And one way to do this, maybe you already accumulated a lot of assets from the past, right? So this will show up as an initial net foreign asset position of the US. Or maybe you get, again, this exorbitant privilege, maybe you expect that in the future, your assets will have higher returns than your liabilities, right? And this return differential, again, it generates additional income that can be spent on imported goods. So, this has to be true in the data. It has to be true in almost any model that we write, that the sum of these three terms has to be equal 0, right? This is the intertemporal budget constraint. So if you have negative first term, at least one of these terms needs to be positive. So let me postpone discussion of exorbitant privilege, till the very end. Let me now focus on the first two terms in this expression. So again, in a very general class of models, what you usually get is that net export is an increasing function of tariffs, right? You impose import tariff, other things equal, that should decrease imports, improve your trade balance. It's an increasing function of exchange rates. Exchange rate depreciation makes your goods cheaper and generates expenditure switching towards US goods. And then finally, so this is kind of maybe a little bit more surprising, it turns out that, at least in the case of the US, the NFA is also an increasing function of the exchange rate. So why is that? Well, what is NFA? Well, it's foreign assets minus local liabilities, right? US has long position in foreign assets, which are denominated in foreign currency, and it has debt and equity as a liability in dollars, right? And so if dollar depreciates, if exchange rate goes up, it decreases the real value of US liabilities, right? It's, you can say it's inflating away the debt. It doesn't have to be nominal depreciation. It can be real depreciation, but it still generates this decrease in the value of US liabilities. Okay? So now let me go kind of through two kind of extreme arguments that you sometimes hear, but actually they're kind of wrong. So if you talk to trade people, most of trade people, let's say a year ago, before we all kind of started thinking about these issues, I think their first instinct was like this: okay, you increase tariffs, that should decrease imports. Okay, what happens to exports is a bit ambiguous, but suppose you also have export tariff, right? Suppose you impose both import and export tariff, then you will kill exports and imports, and so, by continuity, then it means that also net exports needs to go to zero. So you can kind of eliminate the imbalances using tariffs. So it turns out that this argument is wrong, right? So why is that? Well, imagine that you have NFA, going back here, suppose B zero, your liabilities in dollars are just zero, you just have some assets in foreign currency, then this term doesn't depend on exchange rate, it doesn't depend on tariffs, it doesn't depend on anything, right? It's completely exogenous. And so in equilibrium, whatever tariff you impose, the exchange rate will adjust so that trade balance remains the same. And it's kind of surprising result, but this is what the model would tell you, right? That relative prices, they adjust in response in tariffs so that you still have finite prices. You still have finite relative price of home and foreign good, and in that there will be still some repayment of debt or some negative trade balance. So in a way, if NFA is exogenous, there is nothing you can do with net export using tariffs. So then, one small caveat, of course, again, I'm focusing here on the kind of permanent long-run trade deficit, right? It's not true if you think about intertemporal effect. There's a classical paper by Obstfeld and Rogov, and there's a more recent paper by Costanoy and Werning, which show that if you impose even permanent tariff, it can change, intertemporally the trade balance. So you might improve your trade balance today, but at the cost of deteriorating your trade balance in the future, right? But I will completely abstract from these intertemporal effects. Okay, so then there is another extreme argument, which says that tariffs never work, they never affect trade deficits, because in the end, trade deficit is just current account is savings minus investment, and these things, they kind of don't depend on tariffs. So this argument is also wrong, and why is that? Well, because generically, as I said, NFA does depend on the exchange rate, right? US has more than 180% of GDP in its liabilities, in dollar liabilities, and as long as tariff affects exchange rate, it will change the real value of these liabilities. And so kind of the correct argument is the following. Okay, suppose the country, the US, imposes import tariff. That usually leads to appreciation of the dollar. The appreciation of the dollar increases the real value of dollar liabilities. And so the US will become poorer, right? It owes more money to foreigners, which means that something needs to adjust, right? In equilibrium, the trade balance needs to improve to repay higher debt that the country has. And so it turns out that in the end, it is true that generically tariffs do affect trade balance, and they actually improve the trade balance, but the mechanism is completely different. In a way, it has nothing to do with expenditure switching, it has nothing to do with the trade side of the economy, it actually works through the financial positions. Okay, so you might say, who cares, right? You still get what you want, so why should we even discuss this? Well, actually, it has several surprising implications. So the first one is that, as I said, in this logic, exchange rate needs to appreciate. It's not depreciation of the dollar which improves trade balance, it's actually appreciation. So why is that again, right? Because, okay, you have change in tariff, you have change in the exchange rate, so it's kind of ambiguous what happens here, but if you want to increase trade balance, NFA needs to go down, right? And for it to go down, you need exchange rate appreciation. So it's a good example of kind of partial equilibrium logic versus general equilibrium logic. Another implication of this result is that, okay, suppose your goal is to compute how much the dollar needs to appreciate to close the imbalances. It turns out that you don't need to know trade elasticity, you don't need to know the structure of the trade input-output metrics. The only thing that you need to know is the financial side of the economy. You need to know what are the liabilities of the US, what are the assets of the US, and how much they respond to exchange rate movements. Again, if we take this very simple benchmark where NFA looks like this, okay, I need NFA to go to zero to close trade deficit. Then I need these two terms to be equal to each other, and so I can directly compute exchange rate from US assets and liabilities. I don't need to know any other details about the US economy. Okay. Okay. So here, it's So we did some numerical simulations. This is, not the most advanced kind of model, but in this simple simulation, it turns out that the tariff that you need to close this trade deficit is about 64%. So it's extremely high. Exchange rate needs to appreciate by more than 20%, and that will result in consumption losses of 1.6%, right? So and there are also substantial tariff revenues. Okay, good. So this is, as I said, this is kind of positive analysis, right? This is what you can, in principle, do using trade instruments. Now, do you really want to do that? Well, in some sense, you can already see that this doesn't sound like a great policy, right? Because you impose import tariff, you appreciate the exchange rate, you generate a transfer to the rest of the world, right? This is what is often called in international literature valuation effect, right? You increase your liabilities, which means that you effectively redistributing wealth to the foreign economy, which of course has negative welfare effects on US consumers. And so kind of the key insight here is that in the trade literature, right, this is the standard terms of trade argument why tariffs might be good, right? You impose tariff, exchange rate appreciates, your goods become more expensive, and so that, if you're a monopolist producing that good, that kind of increases your revenues. But once you take into account these asset positions, actually you have also negative valuation effect, right? And so there is kind of a race between these two forces. It's not necessarily true that you actually want to impose high tariff because that is associated with negative valuation effect. And again, in our simple simulations, what you can show is that if you ignore valuation effect, if you only have, if you have balanced trade, you start with balanced trade, then the optimal tariff is about 35%. But once you take into account this valuation effect, the optimal tariff goes down about 4 times, and also the welfare gains from imposing this tariff, they are an order of magnitude smaller. Okay, so it is quantitatively important. So 2 other things that I want to mention here, right? So in a way, it's kind of interesting, right? So starting from 1970s, 1980s, we saw a huge financial liberalization. We see that the gross asset positions of the economies, they went up quite a lot. And so it's interesting that it turns out that these forces, they actually help to sustain this Nash equilibrium where countries do not impose tariffs, right? That actually gains from deviating from the good equilibrium without tariffs, they are relatively small. So countries have relatively small incentives to deviate. So it applies not only to the US, but it also applies to all countries in the world, right? It also means that, financial liberalization, trade liberalization, they kind of go together. They kind of complement each other. There are strategic complementarities between the two. If you kind of unwind one, then another one can suffer as well. And finally, let me just briefly mention this here. So there is another argument that you hear quite often is that, okay, maybe we don't care about trade imbalances so much, or welfare. Maybe what we care about is the employment in the tradable sector, right? That can be one of the other arguments why countries impose tariffs. So it turns out that in this model, it's actually, again, wrong argument in a way. Why is that? Well, because when you impose tariff, okay, you increase your trade balance, but at the same time, both imports and exports go down. It's just that imports go down more than exports. But exports go down, and if you compute these things together, it turns out that the size of the tradable sector decreases, the size of non-tradable sector increases, so employment reallocates from tradable sector to the non-tradable sector. Again, I don't want to push the argument too far. Imagine that you only care about steel sector, right, steel industry, and steel industry competes with producers from China. If that's your objective, then of course you want to impose import tariffs and protect that particular sector. But if your goal is broader, if you want to support all manufacturing, right, not only the one competing with China, but also exporting one. If you want also to support other tradable sectors like services, some service sectors, right? So then it's actually very counterproductive policy. Okay, so finally, let me go back to the exorbitant privilege. So as I said, in a way, most models which try to explain global imbalances, in one way or another, they rely on something like exorbitant privilege, right? That the fact that US pays lower returns on its liabilities than it earns on foreign assets, and so it kind of gets this net income, positive net income on average across periods. So that's kind of the third component here. So unfortunately, I think we still don't have great theory which explains how exorbitant privilege is related to tariffs, right? This is kind of maybe a missing part, and this is an interesting question for future research. So let me give you just 2 stories. So one that we have in our paper, another one that Martin Wolf with Luca Farnaro and others have in their paper. And I think, again, as I said, it's not conclusive. I think this is very much open question. So in our paper, in our model, so the way we kind of, the motive that we emphasize is hedging motive. So imagine that you impose a tariff, right? There is less trade between countries, but one reason that countries hold foreign assets is because they want to hedge against the currency risk and hedging against productivity shocks in other countries, right? In some sense, if you under some parametric assumptions, actually the size of your balance sheet, how much you put in foreign assets, is directly proportional to how many foreign goods you consume, right? You can imagine a case where I just hold a constant share of my Lucas 3, foreign Lucas 3, I just collect dividends and I spend them respectively on home and foreign goods. So it turns out that that's kind of a valid argument. And so in that case, what you get is that once you impose tariffs, you import less goods, right? You also export less goods, and there are less incentives to hold foreign assets in both countries. So as a result, you have the gross positions, the gross cross-border positions, they become smaller, and that will decrease exorbitant privilege, right? So if you have higher returns on foreign assets than what you pay on your liabilities, and then both assets and liabilities go down, the total size of the exorbitant privilege will become smaller, right? So that's kind of the idea. So another story, as I said, the one coming from a paper by Martin Wolf and co-authors, is that there is also this theory of savings glut. And so, okay, let's say that you have China, maybe it's because of industrial policies, because of other policies, it exports a lot of goods to the US, it gets higher export revenues, and then it spends these revenues to buy American assets, right? Now, suppose you impose tariffs, that means that income that China gets from exports go down, and so their demand for American assets will decrease as well, right? There is kind of forced reallocation of spendings, of income spendings on domestic goods instead. And so that will also decrease demand for US assets. And again, right, given kind of the decrease in the balance sheet of the US, it means that the exorbitant privilege will become smaller. Again, these are kind of theories. I don't think we have very good quantification of this mechanism, but this is kind of the starting point. So in terms of just this very simple model, it means that now we have this extra term, which depends negatively on tariffs, right? So which means that once US impose import tariffs, there will be a retrenchment of financial positions, right? Both assets and liabilities go down, exorbitant privilege goes down, and again, that will kind of increase the trade balance of the US. Right? So in some sense, it amplifies the valuation effect, and it actually contributes to improvement in the trade balance. It's another channel. It also unambiguously decreases optimal tariffs, right? Again, exorbitant privilege is good for the US, and so if tariffs are, if tariffs decrease this exorbitant privilege, it means that the optimal tariff that you get will be lower. And finally, and this is kind of the most interesting thing here probably, is that, so far, right, what I told you about NFA, about valuation effects, that relied on dollar appreciating in response to tariff. This is what we usually have in our standard models. Now there is kind of expanding empirical literature, right? We have several papers by Simon Lloyd and Giancarlo Carcetti and co-authors which studies these effects empirically. There is a paper by Tommaso Monacelli, there is another paper by Diego Kensek and others. So I think we're kind of now learning what actually happens in the data, and so far the results are not super conclusive, I would say, so that there is some evidence that usually import tariffs, they lead to appreciation, but there are some exceptions. So, I think this is an open empirical question. But in the end, right, so in this model, how can you get exchange rate depreciation? You can't get it from just the first two terms. If you don't have exorbitant privilege, then unambiguously the dollar will appreciate in response to import tariffs. But once you have these two mechanisms, right, once you allow for exorbitant privilege, actually you can get exchange rate depreciation, right? If demand for US assets decreases sufficiently, then exorbitant privilege will fall so much that it will offset the first two terms, right? It will improve net export, but also it will generate positive NFA because of depreciation of the dollar. And that, of course, the reason we are so much interested in this, because we saw the dollar depreciating in 2025, right? Again, whether it depreciated because of the tariff itself, or maybe it wasn't just a trade shock. Maybe the way financial markets view the government, right? What policies, monetary policy, fiscal policy they anticipate in the future. Maybe these expectations changed. So again, this is an interesting question. Okay, so let me conclude by going back to the three questions that I started with. So can tariffs permanently close trade imbalances? Well, the answer is yes, but it actually has very little to do with the trade side of the economy. It's not about trade. It's all about these valuation effects, maybe exorbitant privilege, but it all works through the financial markets. And if we want to understand this question, we really need to kind of dig much deeper into financial side of the US balance sheet. Then, is optimal tariff higher under trade deficit? Well, the answer is no, right? Precisely because of these negative valuation effects, the optimal tariff will be lower. And then finally, do tariffs undermine US exorbitant privilege? Well, the answer is yes, because of this retrenchment of financial positions. It is kind of natural to expect that exorbitant privilege will get smaller, and that, again, further improves trade balance, but it also means that welfare cost of such policy is higher. Okay, let me stop here, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dmitry. Now, our second speaker today is Attilio Zanetti, who is a member of the governing board of the Swiss National Bank. He will provide a small open economy perspective on tariffs and trade policy, drawing on Switzerland's experience as a highly open economy outside of a large trade bloc. In particular, he will discuss how recent tariff increases and trade fragmentation affect small economies and with implications on monetary policy. Please, Attilio.
So thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to the organizers for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with Dmitry and Amy today. So what I will do is to take a different perspective than the one Dmitry took, so a more policy-oriented presentation concerning a country that is a very open, small and very open economy. Of course, I don't expect you to want to become experts in the details of the Swiss economy, but I hope that the presentation will give you some insights that are of general interest. So I will articulate the presentation in 3 steps. The first one will be about what I call the Swiss business model. So what openness actually concretely means in the case of Switzerland. The second part will be on the tariff shock of 2025. And then I'll conclude with a third part on the implication of this business model, of these features of the Swiss economy for monetary policy. So let me start with the foundation of this structure of the Swiss economy. What you have here are 2 measures of how integrated the Swiss economy in the global economy is. On the left-hand side, you have a classical measure. It's the sum of goods and imports and exports and service imports and exports as a share of GDP. And what you have on the right-hand side is an index that is computed by the COF Research Institute in Switzerland. It's a composite index that tries to summarize various dimensions that are connected or linked to the integration of an economy in the global system. That is economic integration, but also political and social integration. And independently of which indicator you look at, you see that Switzerland ranks very high in these rankings in terms of integration. So Switzerland is a extremely strongly integrated economy in the global economy. It's been historically the case. And the point is that this image is not the outcome of an accident, but it's very much intended. It is the way Switzerland has grown over time and positioned itself in the world economy. So on top of being integrated along these criteria, other key features, historically key feature of the Swiss economy are the flexible exchange rate and also a flexible labor market. So the point is, when I say this has not happened by accident, is Switzerland is a country with basically no natural resources. except for some water that allows for up in the mountains, that allows for the production of electricity. So we have no endowments, and the only way for Switzerland to grow and to achieve prosperity is by competing on international markets based on skills, based on knowledge and innovation. So when you think about Switzerland, when people think about Switzerland, most of the time they will mention watches, they will mention chocolate, and they will mention probably pharmaceutical products. Now, all of these products are indeed part of the daily life and the production system in Switzerland. But the thing is that reality is actually much more complex and diverse than that. What you see here on the left-hand side is an index of economic complexity produced by Harvard University, where, without going into the details, the index tries to summarize how good a country is in producing goods and services, in particular goods that are particularly sophisticated, hard to make, and therefore hard to find elsewhere in the world. And you see here, Switzerland ranks second after Japan. On the right-hand side, you have an example. It is a company that I actually visited myself a few years ago that actually produces engines, so-called precision motors, that were integrated in the rover that went to Mars. Now, when preparing this presentation with the economist that helped me to prepare the presentation, he insisted that we had to use the term precision motors. And I said, why are we talking about precision motors? These are motors, and they are part of the robot, that's fine, but why precision motors? Well, apparently precision motor in the industry is an established label that refers to engines that are particularly small and particularly sophisticated. So this is one example of a firm that is actually a medium-sized company that most people don't know about, that has managed to success, competing with just a handful of other firms around the world that are in a position to produce similar goods. Now, as a matter of fact, if you go around the country, the astonishing thing is that you keep coming across, if you pay attention, you keep coming across these kind of hidden champions that we have in our economy. That is, companies that are very good at what they do and compete just with very few competitors around the world. So they tend to be leaders in their own market. So from a micro perspective, this is the kind of market that you would probably qualify as a monopolistic competition. So what happens is that these companies tend to have some pricing power because they compete essentially on quality and know-how. They have a small number of competitors. So the price, of course, is not irrelevant, but it's not the key element for competition. Now, how have we fared historically with this approach internationally? Here you see standard measure, GDP per capita. I think Ireland and Luxembourg are not in there, but these are not the Olympics. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that by any measure of standards of living that you might want to use, Switzerland will tend to rank close to the top. So the model has been effective in lifting standards of living in the country. And this, despite the fact that this correlates historically with a strong currency. What you see on the right-hand side is an index of the real effective exchange rate. And you see that there have been fluctuations in there. There are times when it seemed to be following a steady appreciation trend, and times where it stabilized. But as a whole, the Swiss franc has proven to be a very strong currency. So, and this, of course, is a challenge for a company in general. They have to be aware of the fact that there is no way they will be successful on international markets by competing in terms of price, given the movements of the exchange rate and given the high production costs in the country. So again, what we observe, in fact, it is a success of export activity that goes hand in hand with a currency that has been strong over time. Now, the implication of that is that there has been a constant reshuffling of the economy, a constant churning that has moved companies and productions along the value chain increasingly towards high added value products. So you see here, we have pharmaceuticals, we have precision instruments, chocolate is up there in the pink part of the box. But we also have other stuff, and the composition of goods exports in the country has kept changing. And even within those colors, within precision instruments, for instance, you will have over time a constant adjustment of the production and of the company structures to the needs of the world economy, again, based on quality and innovation. Now, I mentioned the rover on Mars, but here, I happen to visit companies around the country on a regular basis. And for instance, a few years ago, I came across a company. So you see the light blue on top. This is textile. Switzerland historically had a very important textile industry going back to the Industrial Revolution. So this has disappeared almost, but you still see there is some part of light blue component. We still have a textile companies. And a few years ago, I came across a company that manages to export textile to China. I was really surprised. And it turned out that they produce fabric that is particularly resilient and is used in China for the seats of long-distance buses. But this gives you a sense of how Swiss companies manage to stay competitive in very difficult markets. By the way, chocolate is up there as I said, in the pink part of the chart. Something that might come as a surprise to you is that we actually export 3 times more coffee than we export chocolate in the country. Nobody would think Switzerland exports coffee, but we do. Now, openness has been a key element of the success of the Swiss economy. So we have taken huge advantage of that approach over time. But of course, sometimes this comes with risks and shocks. So what you see here is the table that was used for the announcement of tariffs on Liberation Day. So Switzerland was hit particularly hard with a tariff rate of 31%. So there are countries on this table that were hit even harder than Switzerland, but they're typically not the countries we compete with. So most of the countries we compete with were actually affected by a lower tariff rate. So, and then on the right-hand side, you see how these announcements changed over time. It initially went down, and then in August, it picked up to 39%, not too far from the optimal rate Dmitry mentioned. And so it's been moving around. The latest announcement is 12.5%. Now, how does this affect the Swiss economy? I think there are three elements to it. Number one is the tariff per se. Of course, it will affect different companies in a different way. The level of taxes is per se an issue. The second issue is uncertainty. Given the volatility in the announcement, it's been very hard for companies to anticipate what the future will look like, and in turn, it has an impact, or it has had an impact on hiring and investment. But more generally, also on the strategy of the company, which markets should they focus on, and so on. The US is, in general, for these high value-added goods, of course, typically for Switzerland, an important market. So this shock was not, could not clearly be ignored. The second element was the uncertainty. The third element is what I mentioned right at the beginning. It is that Switzerland was initially, and we don't know where we will end up, affected differently than competitors. So one thing is to have 15% tariffs if everyone has 15% tariffs. Another thing, of course, is to have 15 if someone has 20 or 10 or 5. That changes completely your competitive position. Now, as Dmitry mentioned, I will not go into the details. As Dmitry mentioned, these reciprocal tariffs were based on the bilateral goods trade balance. So, and that for the year 2024. So in 2024, what happened is that, well, Switzerland, first of all, is an important hub worldwide for refining gold. I mean, we don't produce gold, we don't have gold, but gold goes through Switzerland. It is refined because we are historically an important center for refining gold, and a large part of the global market, gold global market, goes through Switzerland because of that. So gold comes to Switzerland from South Africa, India, London. Ultimately, it is bought by some US client, but it goes through Switzerland to be refined so that the gold bars are shaped in the expected way, in this case in the US, because the US has different standards than other countries. So it turns out that these gold flows qualify as Swiss exports. So what you see here is that on the left-hand side, in 2024 already, there was an increase in total exports that was very much correlated with the increase in the stock of gold used by COMEX to actually back up derivative products on the COMEX New York exchange. So the uncertainty about the future of the gold market, the fear that the new administration might introduce taxes that might disrupt the market, led in anticipation already in 2024 to an increasing gold demand from the US for these purposes. And then you see at the beginning of 25 that skyrocketed. There was a huge increase in the trade surplus with the US The second thing that skyrocketed at the time were pharmaceutical exports, also in anticipation of taxes that might have been, tariffs that might be imposed on pharmaceuticals. The interesting thing is that then the US administration decided that gold will be exempted. Gold and pharma will be exempted from tariffs. So what happened afterwards is you see the blue line declined dramatically, and as we speak, we have a huge trade deficit with the US because that gold that was exported for uncertainty reason, given the fact that the administration clarified that gold was not going to be imposed by tariffs, led to a return flow to Switzerland. So this gold is coming back from the US to Switzerland. At the moment, we are importing huge amounts of gold from the US that are going to end up somewhere else in the world. You know, on the right-hand side, what you see basically focus on the plain black line. You will see that if you were to focus on the bilateral relationship between Switzerland and the US based on trade of goods and services, these are being basically close to zero over the last several years. So actually the trade relationship between the US and Switzerland are very balanced if you include services. Okay, good. What does that all mean from a monetary policy perspective? Let me be very clear. So talking about trade policy and monetary policy is a bit of a slippery slope. Let me be very clear here. There is no scope for monetary policy to compensate for tariff shock in a sense that there is no responsibility and no intent of monetary policy to act in order to reestablish competitiveness that is affected by tariffs. So tariffs, policy, and trade policy and tariff negotiation are the responsibility of government. The way the central banks looks at something like that, a shock like that, is from the price stability perspective. So the question is, what does all this mean in terms of price stability and the reaction of the central bank? Here, I will mention two structural features of the Swiss economy again, just to put this into perspective. So Switzerland typically is a country with historically low inflation by international standards. So if we take the period since the end of Bretton Woods, average inflation has been around 1.5% in Switzerland. If you take the last 20 years, where the global economy has been affected by repeated crises and major shocks, then average inflation in Switzerland is around 0.6%. So we start from an average low level of inflation. That means a strong preference in the country for price stability. The other aspect goes back to the currency dimension that I referred to at the beginning. The Swiss franc is a strong, historically strong currency, and the peculiarity of the Swiss franc is that when a global economy is hit by a shock, and in particular when European economy is affected by negative shocks, the Swiss franc tends to appreciate as a safe haven currency. So although the Swiss economy might be negatively affected by the shock in the global economy, given its openness, you would expect, in case of such a shock, you would expect the exchange rate to depreciate and act as an automatic stabilizer, caution the negative demand shock. What happens very often, not always, but very often, is that An appreciation of the Swiss franc compounds the global demand shock and has further disinflationary effects. So now, bearing these two aspects in mind, two elements that are kind of structural in nature and are a consequence of the structure of the Swiss economy are the following. Number one, we consider, in the case of Switzerland, given the openness of the country, given the fact that close to 25% of our CPI is composed by imports, goods, and services, and given the instances of volatility of the exchange rate, we consider that a point target for the definition of price stability is not optimal. We prefer to operate with a definition of price stability that is a range and that gives to monetary policy more options. So concretely, in the case of Switzerland, price stability is defined as an annual inflation rate between 0 and 2%. This is the shaded area that you see in the chart on the left-hand side. The second structural aspect is that with the decline in the equilibrium real rates, the implementation of monetary policy has changed, has evolved. The policy rate that you see here on the right-hand side as the black line, the policy rate is the main instrument of monetary policy. But this has been complemented when needed by foreign exchange market interventions, in particular in order to avoid extreme movement, extremely appreciation movement and rapid appreciation movements that again would jeopardize price stability by creating deflationary pressures. So, and you see that in the period since the between the great financial crisis and then the pandemic, the balance sheet of the central bank has experienced wave of extension, of increase due to this complementary role of XI interventions. Now, coming to the 2025 announcement shock, we were already at close to 0 with the policy rate, and inflation was at the beginning of 25 at 0.4%. Then the Liberation Day came, and you see the straight line, that's where Liberation Day occurred. And as I was mentioning before, the reaction of the exchange rate is not the reaction of the exchange rate that you would expect for a country that is highly exposed to the global economy, highly exposed to the US market, because in fact, the Swiss franc appreciated significantly both against the euro and even more so against the US dollar. That brought down inflation further. It was even slightly negative in May because the impact of the exchange rate on inflation occurs very rapidly, and it remained close to 0 throughout 25. On the right-hand side, you see the reaction in terms of monetary policy. The interest rate, the policy rate was cut down to 0 in June, and in the second quarter of 2025, for the first time in several years, the central bank intervened again in the FX market. Good. Summing up, I think Switzerland is an example of an extremely open economy that has taken enormous advantage of that approach. It implies continuous innovation, continuous adjustment in the economy. It implies focusing on innovation, on quality because you cannot rely on cheap production costs, you cannot rely on a weak currency to maintain competition. Of course, you know, your strength can turn it into a problem the day the environment changes the way it has been changing with global trade policies since 2025. Again, the role of the monetary policy is not to solve this problem. I want to be very explicit. It is to focus on price stability and internalize this shock, try to figure out how this shock transmits to the economy, and then determine the optimal or the appropriate, in practice, in the real world, you seldom have optimal reaction. You try to have the best possible reaction. So trying to have the appropriate reaction to maintain price stability. Thank you very much for your attention.
In your framework, I mean, how would that, well, I can begin with some background. I mean, in Europe, there's currently a discussion about adopting tariffs frameworks that are similar to the Section 301 tariffs that are in the US. And Dmitry, so in your framework, how does that picture if tariffs becomes more systemic rather than unilateral and adopted by a great number of countries rather than just single one? I mean, how would that change the picture? And also, if, well, have the opportunity, Attilio. So if Europe goes down that road, adopting tariffs similar to the US, what do you then see as the biggest macroeconomic risks for Europe, but also particularly for a small open economy like Switzerland? So should we begin with Dmitry?
Okay, yeah, I think there are two things here, right? So one is that Europe imposes tariffs against the US, and then in some sense, right, what I described, like US imposes tariff, dollar, you know, moves, that creates valuation effect towards the Europe, you kind of undo that, right? Effectively, you can show even in this simple model that sometimes the tariff in the US is so high that for Europe there is no incentive to retaliate. It actually gains from this tariff. I mean, terms of trade, of course, will always work against Europe in this case, but valuation effect can kind of compensate for that. Again, I don't think this is what happened in 2025 because dollar depreciated, but in principle, right, there can be things like that. Otherwise, of course, you know, it's clearly very bad for the global economy, right? That if both Europe and US impose tariff. I guess another more kind of controversial thing, and this is what people debate a lot about, is whether Europe should impose tariffs on Chinese goods, right? Like China Shock 2.0. So I mean, who am I, right, to judge? But I have very mixed feelings about that, right? So there are kind of strong arguments on both sides. On the one hand, it's hard to ignore political reality, and clearly the Chinese shock is kind of painful for European economies. On the other hand, so what is kind of why we think that Europe might lose from expansion of Chinese trade? I mean, right? The benchmark is usually that if other country wants to cheap goods, this is good news. The main negative effect comes from the fact that China then exports to other countries. Let's say, I don't know, to Latin America, and now Europe, right, which produces very similar products and exports them also to Latin America, it kind of loses these markets, right? And so that's how kind of expansion of China becoming more productive, can hurt Europe. But that's competition for the third markets, not for European markets so much. And there is, if you impose tariffs just on the imports in Europe, that will not help, that will not solve that problem. Right, so in that sense, I think it's not super effective tool, much less effective than, for example, subsidies or industrial policies, and you need to kind of weight this costs and gains, I think.
Again, this trade policy is responsibility of government, so I'm just speculating. But just to give you maybe an indirect answer about the Swiss approach to this question, this is really contrary to the Swiss DNA. I mentioned that Switzerland has a substantial web of international agreements to promote market access. What I didn't mention is that Switzerland historically has self-imposed very low tariffs on imported industrial goods. And in fact, in 2024, it got to the point where Switzerland unilaterally decided to cancel all tariffs on imported manufacturing industrial goods. So it's just a word that is difficult to picture, and the answer is that it will have enormous social costs, welfare costs, so I hope we are not going to go there.
All right. I'll just allow myself to ask one more question to each of you. Well, Dmitry, you mentioned industrial policy just before. I mean, that's also something that's happening more and more along with tariffs. So would you say that the tariffs themselves are becoming more or less effective in achieving the trade balance reduction or improvement when they are part of industrial policy?
If they're part of the industrial policy?
Part of the industrial policy packages along with subsidies and local content requirement, all this stuff.
Yeah, no, I think, again, right, I mean, both policies, they have their own costs, right? I mean, but if you abstract from fiscal costs and if you just think in terms of aggregate welfare, I think usually industrial policies, they are less costly for the society relative to tariffs. Tariffs are usually more distortionary, right? Especially if you think that there are, increasing returns to scale, if you think there are some externalities. I mean, this is usually how we rationalize these interventions, and then actually subsidies kind of make much more sense rather than protecting your market with tariffs.
Maybe can I add something? The thing is that research will then at some point tell us what these tariffs has actually produced in practice. I mean, I think it's too early to tell. There is lots of volatility in the numbers. Again, lots of front loading, lots of companies that don't really know yet how to position themselves because this is like a moving target. But initial evidence suggests that there is a variety of reactions in the economy. I mean, we asked right after the shock in spring 25 how companies plan to react to that, and 1/3 of the companies were in a position to actually transfer the entire tariff on the ultimate US consumer or buyer. 1/3 kind of shared the burden with the intermediary in the US, and 1/3 had to take, at least in the short run, the tariffs on their own profit margins. So I think it's really depending on the market segments and so on, the effect of tariffs might be very, very, very diverse. I think it's very difficult to, in my view at least, to make a very general statement on the impact of tariffs and the success of tariffs in terms of industrial policy.
Can I add to that? Okay, I think this is a very important point, but also, right, so even if you have full pass-through, still for consumers price goes up, and in terms of quantities that consumers buy, right, that might decrease. I guess in case of Switzerland, as you also said, Switzerland is producing kind of goods which is very hard to substitute. The elasticity of demand is very low, I guess, right, and so that's why the quantities don't change very much. But for many other countries, I'm sure quantities would adjust. And there are these estimates that the pass-through of US tariffs into consumer prices, it is actually very high, something like 0.93. I think this is from a paper by Brent Nyman and Gita Gopinath, but 0.93 sounds like a very high number. But actually, again, it's not one, right? And if you compute the optimal tariff given this pass-through, it is still something like 10-12%, right? So, it's a big difference between 0.93 and 1.
That's a good point. So now we are ready for,
Hi, George Alessander from Rochester. So I think it's great we're talking about tariffs here in Denmark, which is a country that's probably benefited more from tariffs in its history than any other country, given the sound duties for 300, 400 years. So one of the things I want to, this is sort of addressed more towards Dmitry, which is the analysis here is super clean, right? It's a permanent shock in a model where there's no other shocks, no other accumulable factors, there's no distortions. So it's not the world we live in. So I wonder a little bit if you could talk about how robust your findings are to a more general world where we're living with shocks and even the tariffs can be somewhat temporary. And then just following up on that empirically, I think Attilio was showing us that the trade balance did respond to tariffs, right? We saw this massive kind of widening of the US trade deficit in advance, then we saw a reversal, and then now we see actually the trade deficit it's not really that big considering the boom that we have in investment going on. So I wonder if you could kind of talk about some of these aspects and how we should be thinking about the results you're putting forward is that tariffs aren't a mechanism for affecting the trade balance. Thanks.
May I just add an aspect to your question? I don't know whether it was clear enough to me, but that volatility in the trade surplus that has now turned into a trade deficit with the US is driven by two products, categories. One is gold, and the other one is pharmaceutical. These are basically the only two products that are actually not affected by tariffs.
But they were expected to be, and it's not just Switzerland, it's all countries, right? We have a massive widening of the US trade deficit in advance.
Yeah, okay. But in the case of Switzerland, the funny thing, if you want, is that the anticipation actually generated enormous volatility in the two goods category that they ended up not being affected by.
Expected tariff wasn't realized.
Yeah, let me just add. So I think these are excellent questions, right? So in terms of temporary tariffs, so the first reaction, right, is that it should create intertemporal switching, right? That if it's more expensive to buy foreign goods today, then it's probably better to buy them later on. And I guess especially for durables, that makes a lot of sense, right? Or instead you kind of buy them before the tariff takes place. So that is clearly very important, right? And yeah, I mean, whether, Trump administration would be happy with that effect, suppose it improves trade balance for a few quarters or maybe a few years, but then, you have even larger deterioration of the trade balance that I'm not sure about, right? I think that's why it's also interesting to think about kind of permanent average trade deficit. But I agree, definitely, right, that in the short run, you can achieve this objective of reducing trade deficit by just imposing temporary tariff. Regarding second best, right, world, that in reality, of course, there are many frictions. And I mean, it's a difficult question, right? So clearly, you can always come up with such frictions in the economy which will rationalize almost any policy intervention. Again, it's kind of a bit of a dangerous path, right? I think Argentina and some other emerging economies, they provide a good kind of counterexample, right? So, okay, you think there is externality here, you make this intervention. Okay, once you have this intervention, maybe you want to do tariffs. Once you have tariffs, you think that, well, I also want to have capital controls. Once I have capital controls, I also want to change, fiscal system. And actually, instead of converging to first best, you kind of go further and further and further away from the first best, right? And so we see that happening in some countries. Again, right, like each step makes a lot of sense. As long as you take other instruments as given, as long as you take the rest of the economy as given, it kind of makes sense to introduce, more and more instruments, make more and more interventions. But in the end, you end up with extremely distorted economy, right? And it actually also gets locked in by political economy forces. So that's why, I don't know, right? We can rationalize tariffs. I think that you can provide arguments for them kind of based on second best, but it's also a bit of, I think, a dangerous path to go.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, during the recent G7 meetings, I guess there was a lot of discussion about the Chinese currency being undervalued or not, so kind of getting your general views on heavily managed exchange rates together with tariffs and how that works. And more specifically, I guess in Dmitry's model, a lot of the adjustment really in response to the tariffs, right, happen through the exchange rate, but how should I think in a model where the exchange rate is actually not allowed to adjust because it's heavily managed and then a tariff gets imposed?
Right. No, that's an extremely important question, right? So I guess, right, if you think about the US against the rest of the world, there are still most countries which do allow the exchange rate to adjust. But of course, if you start thinking about the effects against China, this becomes extremely important. So I think it's actually, again, this is one of these questions that people debate right now. So what needs to happen to close these global imbalances between China and the US? There are people who say that you should just focus on the exchange rate, right? China should allow exchange rate to adjust, should allow exchange rate to appreciate, and then that kind of on its own will kind of rebalance the global economy. There are other people, so the report by Gita Gopinath and Helen Ray, so they actually emphasize some things slightly different. They say exchange rate is not so important. It will move in the right direction eventually, but it's kind of a sideshow. What China really needs to know, it needs to kind of redirect aggregate demand towards domestic goods, right? Non-tradable goods, services, etc. So instead of imported goods, instead of just suppressing demand, right, and just most of growth coming from exports. So I think there is this debate, but in the end, I think it's not like one view contradicts the other. I think in the end, how do you kind of rebalance this demand? Well, for you eliminate part of capital controls, you eliminate part of FXI, you redistribute larger fraction of income towards households, and in equilibrium exchange rate will also move in the right direction. But that's kind of an important part, right? And then, of course, there is a separate discussion what the US needs to do, and it's mostly about fiscal adjustment.
So I had a question for Dmitry mainly. So I like the whole setup and the framework you have, and I very much like the focus on the importance of the net financial assets and the net financial assets of a country. And those net financial assets and the financial effects within external imbalances matter a lot, not just for the US, also for Switzerland. But I think what we see in the data is that it's not simply the exchange rate moving the financial assets and liabilities. A lot of the financial assets and liabilities are nowadays risky assets. And this type of risky assets and the different risk-sharing properties of the assets and liabilities of different countries are never in our international macro models. But if you look at how sensitive net foreign asset positions are to exchange rate movements versus relative equity movements, especially in recent years when there's been a huge boom in the US stock market, the risky assets, the equity markets would actually dominate the exchange rate movements. And they would go in the opposite direction, I think, of what you have. If you still have the US dollar as a safe haven currency, it's appreciating in bad times, but now bad times are times when the US equity market is collapsing more than the rest of the world equity market because it's the high beta market. Then I think you kind of could turn into a world where the tariff actually has the opposite effect on the trade balance by your logic. Am I thinking about it correctly, and how important do you think it is to think about this in this framework?
Thank you. Very interesting. So let me start from the kind of end of your question, right? So I don't know, if we take 2008, US stock market fell a lot, but global market fell even more, right? Like if we look at Gurinch's Ray paper where they look at this international transfers, implicit transfers, we see that stock market abroad collapsed more, and that's why there was kind of a transfer from the US to the rest of the world. So at least for 2008, we have this evidence. I'm not sure, right, how it will play out in the future. But in general, I fully agree with this, right? So I emphasize exchange rate movements, but in principle, even imposing tariffs that can affect the value of equity and treasuries directly without movements in exchange rate, right? Maybe US tradable sector becomes much less productive because of tariffs, so the equity of these companies will go down, and that will also create valuation effects, right? It just seems like it seems like exchange rate should be the first thing that responds to tariffs. That's why we focus on that channel, and but more generally, of course, there might be other sources of valuation effects. But I think the big message remains the same, right? So if you want to understand how tariffs affect imbalances, you should really focus on financial side, not the trade side. But there's much more to be done on that, definitely. Can I maybe ask one question, Attilio, while we're waiting for other questions? So can I, or if you want to add something?
No, please go ahead.
It's kind of related also to the question that we discussed before, and it's a bit of provocative question. So Switzerland has been running trade surplus for many years, if I understand correctly, right? And if anything, it was kind of increasing. So can't you kind of apply the same argument that we often hear about China and some other countries that maybe a Swiss franc is undervalued, that it should appreciate more, and especially we see that central bank occasionally intervening. So what is kind of your reaction? Will Switzerland eventually spend these reserves on foreign goods? Yeah, how do you see it kind of in the long run?
Yeah, we have a current account surplus. We've had a current account surplus, substantial current account surplus for years. But when you look at the current account surplus and try to explain it with fundamental factors, in particular the pension scheme that we have and the aging population, the conclusion, inclusively the conclusion of the annual review of the IMF is that those numbers are in line with fundamentals, also because there are, in the headline numbers, there are also measurement issues. So in the long run, I would expect that to go back to zero or even turn negative. But given the current structure of the Swiss economy, that seems to be in line with, or is in line with fundamentals. And that's why, I mean, it's very difficult, given also the, what I mentioned before about the price elasticity of goods exports, this is something that is difficult to correct through an appreciation. I mean, that's why we consider, I mean, the Swiss franc as no, the current account surplus as not being a correct indicator of potentially undervalued currency, quite the opposite. I mean, all the analyses tend to conclude, and not only the analysis that we do, but I'm referring to the IMF in particular and others, that actually the Swiss franc has been a strong currency. We have shown also the tendency to actually to appreciate in real terms. So we kind of have a different, the opposite problem. By the way, also the fact, as I mentioned, that we have on average very low inflation, and over the last 20-25 years, really an inflation rate that is around 0.6%. It's not, doesn't seem to be an indicator of an undervalued currency.
Okay, I think, oh, that's our question. Yep.
Like just one quick question for Dmitry about the model. So in the model, you're emphasizing the long run behavior, right? But that's like an economy. I mean, if we think about using the model to inform current situation, for the US, you have like a negative net foreign asset position and trade deficit. So like, that will require some assumption about how the adjustment is gonna play out, right? Because even in the model without any tariff or anything, if you take like a standard model of the determination of the net foreign asset position, you will have that, well, if you have such large negative net foreign asset position, then eventually we should observe some, either, some change in the valuation, some valuation effect or some reversal of the trading flow. Like how can you then the model to evaluate the current situation?
So in terms of accounting, right, this budget constraint, there are kind of two possibilities. I mean, I guess three more generally. So either looking at the past 30, 40 years and seeing this trade deficit, it's still temporary thing. It's a very, long lasting, but it's a temporary thing. Eventually it will reverse. And that's one view of the world, right? It's very hard, I mean, to know, but that can be one view of the world. And then you have negative NFA, but the trade balance in the future on average should be positive. So that's one possibility. Another possibility that we just mismeasure NFA, right? There's all this literature about hidden wealth of nations, right? That profit shifting, etc. And so maybe we just mismeasure these things, right? And actually, US has much higher foreign assets than what we see in statistics. And finally, the third possibility, and that's which we kind of emphasize most, is that there's also exorbitant privilege, right? So you have negative NFA, you have negative trade balance, but you kind of get these high returns on foreign assets and pay low returns on liabilities. And if that lasts long enough, that kind of compensates. I mean, these are all kind of theoretical possibilities, and then Sure. I agree, right? I think reality is probably somewhere, it includes all three components. Quantitatively, it's hard to say.
Sorry, a quick question. Pietro Cova, Banca d'Italia. How much is similarity of exports and imports? Does it matter? I mean, listening to the Swiss experience, it seems now they have exceptional products that are made only in Switzerland, so it's even if you apply a tariff. While in all our models of Sverov, there is never a distinction where you look at how similar is the exports and imports in bilateral trade Does it matter according to
Sure,
you?
sure, yeah, sure, right. I mean, I think exactly like Switzerland is a great example of that, where we did some work, some previous papers, we calibrated model to Switzerland, and then you kind of see how you really need these elasticities to make them very, very low to get the reasonable effects, because otherwise, how can you have such huge appreciation of the currency and still trade balance kind of improving and exports going up, right? But I mean, fortunately, again, this is not what I'm working on, but there are fortunately much work now which takes seriously this input-output networks and different elasticities across sectors, right? And so, this kind of Bakai-Fari machinery, I guess, and Shabnem has a lot of papers about that, like taking more seriously heterogeneity across goods, across sectors, and then taking into account these effects. And quantitatively, that definitely matters a lot.
I don't see any more hands in the air. So with those words, let's give the speakers a round of hands, and then thank you.
Thank you very much.